create a single economy, bring all of the people of the West Indies together into a labor market, a capital market, federate the resources, and access international support for this region. In other words, forget Britain. Forget Britain. Let us look to the Americas. Let's look to Canada, the United States. Let's look to the neighbors, to the South, Colombia, Venezuela, but forget Britain. Let us federate, industrialize, and pursue a broader policy of looking to the North for development support through trade and finance. That was his vision. And so our leaders accepted that. They bought into the Lewis paradigm, they agreed it, and they put the Federation in place. The Federation had three planks: the integration of the Caribbean economy, the integration of Caribbean people, and the creation of an economy linked into the North American economy, removing itself from the British colonial structure. And that is what. So they arrive in England to have approved this federation. When the British saw that within that federation concept was industrialization and independence, the British government was horrified that the West Indians could come to England and put this idea in front of them: industrialization and independence. The British told them to disavow themselves of that. We will help you with federation. And so our concept of federation was rejected. The British wrote their own version of federation and told the West Indian leaders, this is the federation you will have. And we signed on to it. So when the mythology that has existed for some 50, 60 years in the literature, that our federation failed and Jamaica mashed up the federation, all of that is nonsense. What we know was that the British wrote a version of federation, refused to fund the version they wrote, put Jamaica in an untenable position that Jamaica would pay 48% of the cost of the federation, because Britain knew that Jamaica was the countries whose politics was closest to independence. Jamaica was already talking about independence. With or without federation, Jamaica had reached the stage, Norman Manley and the labor movement, they were already thinking of independence. And so when Britain told them to sign on to this federation, and one country, Jamaica, must pay half the cost of the whole thing, Jamaica, of course, says, no, we can't do that. How can we do that? How can we take responsibility for half the cost of this thing that you call federation? Jamaica said, we cannot do that. Quite rightly so. Because it was a strategy conceived by the British to create their own federation, ram it down their throats, don't fund it, mash it up, and then leave the responsibility upon us that we are the ones who mash up the federation, not them, we. You see, when you go through their correspondence and you read their official documents, you really get to see what they did. You have to read this thing for yourself, that they planned this thing so scientifically. And of course, when Jamaica decided to go for independence, in July 1962, Bustamante, Sir Alexander, leads a delegation to London to meet with the British government to have what is called the Golden Handshake. We're parting ways, but we have an industrial development plan, and we're going to England to ask the British to give us some funding for our industrial development plan. That will be the basis of the new nation. Now that is when the correspondence began. The British High Commissioner in London Sir Morley, his correspondence is now available to us. The letters from the British High Commissioner to the Prime Minister of Britain. One of the issues. Do you think Jamaica is ready for independence? Jamaica is as ready for independence as a 3-month-old baby is ready to change its diaper. That comes out of the British High Commission in Kingston. Mr. Prime Minister, they are coming. When they arrive, you must be civil to them. But you must let them know that we owe them nothing. We must also let them know that they and they alone are responsible for the poverty on their island. You must let them know the following. You have a premier who is a trade union leader. How can a premier be a trade union leader? If the premier is the leader of the biggest trade union, he will inflate the wages of his workers. And that is what he has done. And it has mashed up the Jamaican economy. So let them know that the premier and the premier alone is responsible for undermining the Jamaican economy, leading to poverty. Let them know that. But you must give them something. You must give them something. As a matter of respect, give them something. A token gesture. So, they invited Buster. He met with them. He said, British government, we have a 5-year development plan for Jamaica. We're going to build factories. We're going to create jobs, industrial jobs. And we just need you to help us to fund the construction of these factories. Well, Mr. Prime Minister, you know that things are difficult in Britain as well. You know, we would love to help you, but we can't. However, we will give you a little something. It was at that stage that the young politician, Edward Seaga, who was a part of the Prime Minister's delegation, Mr. Edward Seaga lost his cool. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever known Edward Seaga. Edward Seaga is not known for losing his cool. Edward Seaga was always a very cool, maybe too cool person. Maybe cold. Mr. Seaga lost his cool and told the British Prime Minister, you have exploited our country for 300 years. He said, we have school places for 7% of the children on this island. And we have housing for 10%. How can we build a nation like this? This is what you've done to us. And Seaga lost his cool and chastised him about the poverty they had left behind. Well, they were asking for about 30 million pounds. They got one. They got one. Then it was Jamaica's turn, Trinidad's turn. Eric Williams and the same correspondence. The British High Commissioner in Port-au-Spain, Mr. Costar, his correspondence to London. We must treat this premier differently from how we treated the prior one. The prior one that said, Mr. Bustamante is illiterate. You must speak to him as you are speaking to a 14-year-old child. He cannot understand any concept, so you must speak to him simply. He is really a demagogue, a buffoon, and that was the language they used, the High Commissioner used to describe Sir Alexander. But Eric Williams, they went the other way. He has received the finest British education available. He's the author of a book called Capitalism and Slavery, in which he argued that our magnificent industrial culture is rooted in the vile circumstance of slavery. He has sought to embarrass our nation, and you must return it to him. Well, Eric Williams arrived for the golden handshake, development. Same thing. We have a 10-year development plan for Trinidad and Tobago. We are going to independence. This is our vision. This is our development model. Britain, you owe us part of this. You owe us the debt. They gave Eric Williams nothing. He was treated like an imposter, cold. They dismissed him. Eric Williams described the hatred that he experienced in that conversation about a golden handshake, a development plan for his country. Eric Williams left the British Parliament, having gone through that, and went to address the Caribbean students in London. And the London Caribbean-based students invited the Premier to address them. And Eric Williams told them that his speech will be entitled The Orange. Well, of course, the students had no idea what Dr. Williams was going to speak about. The orange? What is the orange? So he arrived, typical Doc. Doc went enigma, Eric, and told them that my presentation this afternoon is entitled The Orange. And then there was this long pause. And Eric Williams said, well, that is how the British government, that is how it sees us, as an orange. They have sucked us dry and thrown the peel onto the ground. And proceeded to speak about the orange, about being a part of Caribbean civilization that had been sucked dry and the peel dashed upon the ground. He got nothing. The Federation, of course, had been dashed aside. Each island was now looking to plan its own vision. And in the correspondence from Britain, there is the celebration. The celebration of the fact that now we have them how we want them. Each island fending for itself. But having treated Sir Alexander like that, and having treated Dr. Williams, it was Grantley Adams' time. Grantley Adams was the premier of the Federation. He was the man who had given his entire life to federate the Caribbean. But he had bought into the British version of the Federation. He was the one who implemented the British version of the Federation. And so when the Prime Minister of Britain signed the document giving Jamaica permission to exit the Federation, the British government did not inform Sir Grantley. They didn't inform him that they had dissolved the Federation, of which he was the Premier. He didn't know. They didn't inform him. Sir Grantley did what I guess any human would do. He jumped on the first available plane and flew to London to meet with the British government to ask, how can you dissolve the Federation by parliamentary action? And I am the Premier of the Federation and I was not informed. Now, the correspondence is fascinating. They kept Sir Grantley waiting in London for 7 days before they gave him an audience. They kept him in his hotel for 7 days before they gave him an audience. And when eventually the Prime Minister gave him the audience, the meeting lasted for 10 minutes. 7 days and a 10-minute meeting. Grantley returned to the Caribbean and addressed the Federation Parliament for the last time. Told them, I have just returned from England. I was treated with disrespect. I was treated in a way that we would not treat even a civil servant clerk. I was treated with disrespect. Wasn't even told what the action of the British government was. And the question is, how could the British government dissolve the Federation by parliamentary action, and the Premier, the cabinet of that Federation did not know? What I'm trying to say to you is that that was all the anger. And so when each request for development support was met with disrespect, it was because of the following point. There was contempt and anger in British Parliament towards the West Indians. What did we do wrong that there was such anger which is shown in the correspondence towards the West Indians? It's because they accused us of breaking up the British Empire. That when the Caribbean people, when the West Indians rose up in the 30s against colonization and demanding independence, the Asians rose up in the 40s. So India and all of the other countries in Southeast Asia rose up in the 40s, and then the Africans rose up in the 50s, and by the 60s it was all over. And they blame us for it. We were the triggers of it. We were the ones, we Caribbean people broke up their empire. Because after we Caribbean had moved, the Indians moved, Mahatma Gandhi and all of his people. After we had revolted, Mahatma Gandhi walked up to the governor's residence in Delhi and knocked on the governor's door. The governor came to the door, and Mahatma Gandhi told the governor, Your Excellency, you, the British, have been here in our country for 200 years. It is now time for you to pack up and go home. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. You can now pack and go home. Let us get on with our history. That's what Mahatma Gandhi told them. We now want to get on with our history. Thank you for coming. Goodbye. Of course, when the governor looked behind this half-naked man with a cloth wrap around and some sandals, when the governor looked behind, he saw 1 million Indians out in the street. And when he saw that 1 million Indians, he wrote home to the British Prime Minister, Mr. Prime Minister, I have just met the Mahatma, but I didn't realize that there were 1 million with him. He is right. It is time for us to pack up and go home. And that was the end of the British Empire in India. Pack up and go home. And they did not forgive us, the West Indians, for triggering all of this. Had not for what we had done in the 30s, we were the first part of the British Empire. We were the first part from the 17th century slavery, and now we were the ones who broke up the whole thing, triggered the chain reaction, mash up the whole empire, and they have not forgiven us for it. We asked for a development plan. Sir Arthur Lewis wrote it down, but we didn't get it. But do you know who got the development plan? The Indians got the development plan. Southeast Asia got the development plan. The plan we were asking for and wrote up, they gave it to the East Indian colonies, not the West Indian colonies. And when the Commonwealth met in Sri Lanka, what was then Ceylon, when they met in Ceylon in 1950, they agreed that the East Indian colonies are in need of a development plan. It became known as the Colombo Plan. because it was signed, sealed, and delivered in Colombo. And so the Colombo Plan was the basis on which Singapore was transformed later on, India was transformed, the same Sri Lanka, Burma, Sumatra, all of those colonies got railways, they got schools, they got hospitals, they got infrastructure, they have agricultural universities, they got all the things that we were asking for, the East Indies colonies got. The Colombo Plan. And that was what was written up by Sir Arthur. They took Sir Arthur Lewis's plan for the Caribbean from the West Indies and implemented for the East Indies. Well, look at us now. Look at India. India is now putting people on the moon. India is now able to land rockets on the moon. Arguably one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world because they got the Colombo Plan. And Britain was extraordinary. They invited Japan and they invited the United States to put some money in that fund for the East Indians. When you study the Colombo Plan for economic transformation and development of the East Indian colonies, and you ask yourself, if 10% of that wealth that was invested in the Colombo Plan was invested in the Lewis Plan, these islands would have been transformed. But that is the background. And so I came to the conclusion. Britain has never been a friend to the people of the Caribbean. There is no evidence whatsoever, having rejected every development strategy, having massacred the people of this region in their quest for development and democracy. Even in the 20th century, as we push further and further, Britain has never demonstrated that it has any respect for the people of the Caribbean. Maybe it is the legacy of the slavery culture that remains. But the reason I wrote the chapter after emancipation, entitled The Nigger Question, is to demonstrate the persistence of that philosophy. In 1849, Thomas Carlyle wrote a very famous article entitled The Nigger Question. The 700,000 black people in the Caribbean had just been emancipated. And their leading philosopher, their leading British political philosopher, published a manuscript entitled The Nigger Question. He was the most influential political philosopher in Britain, close to the Conservative Party or the Tories. And the Nigger Question became standard reading for any English person with an interest in the Caribbean. And his argument was, we the British people made a tragic mistake. We have made a terrible error. We got moralistic, we got soft, we listened to evangelicals, we listened to all of this morality tale, and we made a terrible mistake. Emancipation was the greatest policy error that Britain has ever made, and we must reverse it. We must do all we can now to reverse it. That article became the most important literary paper shaping British politics. It was that paper that led to the massacre of the people at Morant Bay. It was that paper that led to all the bloodbaths in the Caribbean, because that paper persuaded every British government that emancipation was a mistake. And the black people are down in the Caribbean, according to Carlyle, They're down there lying around under coconut trees and eating pumpkins. They have no interest in work. They have no interest in development. They're just lying around in the Caribbean enjoying the sunlight. And that is what we have done. The Caribbean could have been part of a great development if we had kept slavery for another 100 years. We made a mistake. Well, the most progressive political economist of the time, John Stuart Mill, rejected it. John Stuart Mill, very distinguished, fine intellect, wrote a response entitled The Discourse on the Nigger Question. And John Stuart Mill used his enormous intellectual influence to diffuse the political power of Carlisle's nigger question. He did not succeed. And so, when Gladstone became the premier, the Prime Minister of Britain, Gladstone became the Prime Minister of Britain during the American Civil War. And as Prime Minister of Britain during the Civil War, Gladstone said, we must support the Southerners, and through Britain's support behind the Southerners who were fighting to protect slavery. So while the Southerners were fighting to hold on to slavery, the Prime Minister of Britain, 30 years after emancipation, had positioned British foreign policy to support the Southerners. That was proof. And the British Parliament generally supported the Southerners. Now, one can argue that John Stuart Mill, that Gladstone was really acting out his own domestic history. Gladstone's father, John, was the largest slave trader down to Guyana. He dominated the slave trade to Guyana because he came in late. Guyana was booming, and Gladstone made a fortune as the slave trader down in Guyana. And now his son is the Prime Minister. And the son owns the plantations that his father left behind to him. So the father now owns the estates in Guyana. And he is regretting the fact that slavery had abolished. And so Gladstone was the architect, the leading architect of what they call the coolie trade. We can't get the Africans, we're going to India. And then they went to India to bring the indentured servants, because Gladstone was Prime Minister and blessed the whole thing about the coolie trade. Brought the Indians down to Guyana to work on his plantations and all the others, because slavery was a mistake. The abolition was a mistake. And so, the evidence is clear that 100 years after the nigger question had dominated British political thinking, the same set of values still exists in the correspondence of the British government. You can still feel it. You can still feel the nigger question discourse in the correspondence of the British Parliament. And so, when the British Prime Minister Cameron came to visit us and told us a few years ago, well, it was all a horrible history, but let us get over it. Let's move on. Let us get over it. If you, as a Prime Minister, can walk into a parliament filled with the descendants of enslaved people and tell them that was a terrible thing, yes, terrible, but let us get over it and move on. I am saying to you that the discourse on the nigger question is still real in British politics. It is still real in the Windrush discourse. It is still real in all the issues about aid, the refusal to admit in public the debt to the Caribbean. And I was able to find the evidence which shows categorically that they know they have a debt to the Caribbean. They admit it, it's here in their records, but it's also here in their records that we must hush and never say it in public. We must hush. And the purpose of presenting this book was to present the evidentiary basis of their own political culture and narrative. This is filled with the minutes of their cabinets. It's filled with the reports from their high commissions. It's filled with their foreign office correspondence. It's filled with their civil servants advising the prime ministers and the ministers what to say and what not to say, and how to say it. In other words, it is filled with the narrative of deceptive diplomacy. But when they kept Grant Lee sitting for 7 days and then gave him a 10-minute exposure, that was the contempt that they had for all of our leaders, for Eric Williams, for Bustamante, for all of them. That generation that was preparing to lay the ground for Caribbean development, they humiliated them, they degraded them, and they brushed them aside. And now we are here. We are here now to inherit all of this. Our leaders are here to inherit all of this. And the question is, what are we going to do? Are we going to continue believing somehow that Britain is our friend? We heard from David, who said quite correctly, every effort that we have made to develop ourselves, they have blocked them. Every effort, they've blocked it. We know that the sugar banana regime has gone into difficulty. They drove it into the ground. They drove it into the ground and they leave us to hang out to dry. Now we have looked at the world and we say that there is room for a financial services sector. We, the Caribbean people, we have the intellectual skills and we can create a new industry to bring value to our region. And there is room in the global financial services sector for us to advance. We can become a powerful player in the world of finance if we have a level playing field. Well, we've been blacklisted. All of us have been blacklisted one after the next. We are not in compliance. Then we have the situation with correspondent banking. The banks in the Caribbean are told that they cannot do correspondent banking because money laundering is going to become a feature of the banking system, and so the correspondent banking system has been shut down. Massive negative impact on Caribbean finance and banking. So piece by piece, effort by effort, our finest efforts, our greatest strategies to develop this region, push back, undermining, push back. Well, I like to say that our University of the West Indies with 50,000 students in the top 1.5% of the best universities in the world. But we remember that in 1948, they gave us £40,000, £40,000 to build a small medical school for 30 students. That was the gift. A little school in a wooden building on the Mona campus, a wooden building. And they said, we're going to give you a little something to start a medical school. 30 students in a wooden building. And that was their notion of generosity. But we took that wooden building. We took that wooden building. The 30 students. And now we have one of the most beautiful university in the world. We did that. We did that. And we must never take it for granted. We took that little wooden structure they gave us and we built 5 campuses, some of the most beautiful facilities in the world for some of the brightest people in the world. And I'm happy to be here in this building again, because 20 years ago, when I became principal of this campus, this was the first building I constructed. This. Designed it myself. This building, this complex here, thanks to Owen Arthur, of blessed memory. I said to Owen, how can you have a university without a creative arts complex? It's like having a bus and no driver. You need a place of art and creativity, music, dance, film, you need. And I said to him, there's a piece of land across the street. Can I have it? Now, our gentleman who is now our ambassador to Canada, Glenn Clark. Glenn Clark was Minister for Lands. And he came and he said, Principal, I am a graduate of this campus. Take the land and build on it whatever you want. And I said, but Minister, I need a piece of paper that shows that you are giving the university land. I need permission to the town planners to put up. He said, I am a graduate of Careford campus. I'm the Minister of Lands. And I'm telling you, go and put up the building. And I will deal with that sometime in the future. That was a graduate, Glenn. And when this building was up in the air and all kinds of things were going on, the paperwork was not complete. Because we had a prime minister and a minister whose love for this university was so extraordinary that they would have done anything for this university. And that is why we are going to survive. Because our graduates know that this university is the future of this region. They know it. They know it. So colleagues, I thank you for your patience and your generosity of spending all of this time with me here this afternoon.